My name's Teri Flowerday. I'm a professor in educational psychology, and I've been at UNM for 20 years. And I'm a faculty member with IAIE, and I'm very glad to have you all join us today for the February IAIE Brown Bag. We're going to be having a presentation given by Jvanna Hanks. So I'm very, very pleased to have with us this afternoon Ms. Jvanna Hanks. She is the Assistant Superintendent for Business Services with Gallup-McKinley County Schools. She oversees many, many departments: payroll, accounts payable, accounting, community engagement, personnel, construction, procurement, receiving and delivery warehouse, Title I, and discretionary programs. Oh my goodness, you have a big job. She was born in Clovis, New Mexico, but she just told me that she's been out with Gallup schools for almost 20 years now. So I think she claims that as home too. She has worked for Gallup-McKinley County Schools since 2002. And her statement says, impact aid has been a long-term project for me, including a capstone paper on the analysis of the Supreme Court decision on impact aid in the Zuni case. I currently work with other districts, Zuni Public Schools, Central Consolidated, and Grant Cibola Schools, who are similarly situated as we seek to make statutory changes to the crediting of impact aid in the state of New Mexico. So if you're ready, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jvanna because she has a super interesting presentation. I have reviewed it ahead of time, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. So thank you, Jvanna.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, and also for inviting me here today. I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint presentation on the screen. We're talking about today impact aid. And so impact aid was created in 1950. Essentially, things started to ramp up near World War II when large military installations were being put across the United States. And it was taking, of course, those individuals who are called up into military service away from their homes and leaving the people left behind to go to work. And so really what was needed was more infrastructure for schools. Following that was really impact aid, and really looking at what impact the federal government has on local regions when they take large portions of land off of the tax rolls. So when impact aid was created, it essentially looked at large parcels of land that had been taken off tax rolls due to military bases, federal low-income housing, other federal properties where students and their families lived, and tribal lands. Typically, people do refer to this as a payment in lieu of taxes. Because it is essentially replacing lost property taxes in those areas. You know, as I was talking about impact aid implemented in 1950, it has been amended several times, especially as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is amended, as well as the Every Student Succeeds Act is amended. It's kind of re-reconciled into those legislative initiatives to ensure consistency and support to those areas that have been impacted by the federal government. The county that I work in, McKinley County, has two sovereign tribal nations, the Navajo Nation and also the Zuni Pueblo. So taxable land in McKinley County is about an 80-20% split, meaning that 80% of the land is non-taxable land, and only about 20% of the land is taxable land. So our assessed valuation in McKinley County is about $821 million. Statutorily, according to the New Mexico Constitution, our school district can only borrow up to 6% of that assessed valuation, or about $49 million, in order to fund our capital outlay projects. So essentially what we're looking at here is large portions of our property has no property tax value attached to it. Our district bonds heavily, and the reason for that is because we cannot build any facilities without bonding, given our current circumstance. We have 32 schools, some of which are older than 60 years. So they have substantial issues with them. We have several schools that still have asbestos in them, even though it's been largely abated. But the age of our schools and the condition of our schools has really forced us into some different avenues in order to get additional funding for the district. We do as a community, so McKinley County is 4,957 square miles. The furthest school away from where I'm standing is 108 miles one way. We do serve 7 distinct communities. So we have different communities where we have essentially pods of schools with an elementary, a middle school, and a high school. And so each one of those communities we serve. Now, because some of those communities are located entirely on Navajo Nation land, those skilled teachers, licensed teachers, and other administrative staff have nowhere to live. Because of course they can't build or purchase land on the Navajo Nation, and there's no rental units on the Navajo Nation. And so what we've done is actually build teacher housing so that individuals who are teaching our students can live fairly close to the school site that they're teaching at. Now, the state doesn't participate in that funding at this time, and we've spent about $30 million in building those housing units. And realistically, they're absolutely essential to ensure that we have licensed teaching staff, counselors, librarians, the multitude of individuals that are needed to teach our students. A lot of the questions that I get are, is impact aid calculated based upon the taxable value of the land? No, it isn't. Impact aid is actually calculated by eligible students. And so we have to identify students who are situated within the parameters of impact aid. For example, those students would be individuals who would live on tribal land, but attend the school district. Those individuals could also be people who live on military installations and or military housing off-site of a military installation, or individuals who are living in federal low-income housing. And so it's incumbent upon the district to identify those students through surveys and then work with those families to get the supporting documentation needed by the federal government to support our claim of those students. Now, if we have a student who is attending our school district who actually lives technically in another school district's service area, then what we need to do is actually create a formal intergovernmental agreement with that entity. And what will happen is that entity will claim the student on their impact aid application. And then we have an agreement for cost sharing between the two entities. Now, there are 4 different types of impact aid. That is operational, Indian set aside, special education, and construction, which is a competitive grant. So the weighting of students, essentially each student is counted, given an appropriate weight based upon the federal law, and then multiplied essentially times the unit value. So each one of those areas has a specific set of statutory language that aligns to it that tells us a formula of the funding that we should be receiving from the federal government. That is also dependent upon the federal government actually appropriating money towards impact aid. And so federal appropriations impact the amount of money that we will receive. And because this is a year-to-year activity, including appropriation, application, and approval, that money can vary quite heavily. For example, for anyone who lived through sequestration, which was essentially a budget mechanism at the federal level, which stopped federal funding from flowing to states, impact aid was one of the very first programs negatively impacted by that. And it did cost our school district several $1 million. Along those lines, the applications that come in to the federal impact aid office come from all 50 states. And so when they do an estimated amount that you're going to receive, it may go up and it may go down based upon how many applicants actually apply and how many of those applications actually meet the criteria that's established. And so it typically takes about 3 years for us to actually see our full impact aid allocation. And since I've been here and I worked with the district since 2002, we've never been fully funded for impact aid. Our impact aid allocation is always short. So in accessing these funds, it takes a lot of district manpower. I saw Dr. Pauletta White on here. Her and her team do an amazing job in the data collection. We have our student information system. Those individuals do a great job in collecting data for us and identifying eligible students, but it is definitively a team effort, and it takes a lot of manpower to get that application done in a district our size. The state of New Mexico actually speaks to public schools in its constitution. So a uniform system of free public schools sufficient for the education of and open to all the children of school age in the state shall be established and maintained. So in looking at what this means, especially in light of recent litigation, including Yazzie, including Martinez, that consolidated case, and other litigation that's happened, it's really been a determination of how do we identify to be sure that all of our students are getting equitable services. In 1974, the state of New Mexico actually established the State Equalization Guarantee. There have been a couple of different research studies on this. That was the American Institute of Research, the AIR study in 2008. There's also the evaluation of the public school funding formula by the LFC and the LESC in 2011. And these studies have largely stated that change was needed in order to make New Mexico funding more equitable. And how we do that, the SEG is codified in statute. The SEG is under NMSA Chapter 22. And so it specifically spells out how that funding formula is calculated. In the studies that have taken place, and these are independent studies by individuals who are looking at various factors, they really said the funding formula is not doing what you intended it to do. It's actually creating inequities because you've got school districts who meet specific criteria receiving additional funding for needs they don't actually have, and vice versa. You've got school districts who have populations of students who have needs who are not receiving resources. So in New Mexico, that funding formula was initially established in 1974. Now, that funding formula specifically has been modified more than 50 times. It is definitely a work in progress. And when it was initially implemented, the ideology behind it was the equal treatment of equals and the unequal treatment of unequals. And so what they said was, we're going to move away from property taxes being a major influence in how students receive an education. And we're going to assure a student in Las Cruces and a student in Lake Arthur, New Mexico, who are similarly situated, have equal services. Just like special needs students who may need more resources are treated equally based upon their special needs. One of the things that was actually happening was the crediting of local property taxes and impact aid. And so local property taxes used to be collected at about 8.925 mils, which is significant. That's approximately $9 for every $1,000 of taxable property. In 1983, however, that had gone down to 0.5 mils, which means the state was receiving significantly less dollars into the funding formula in order to support the system. So more support started to come from the general fund to actually support the State Equalization Guarantee, creating an extensive amount of variability in the funding that's actually available. During this time, there was even an effort to continue crediting impact aid, but stop crediting local taxes altogether. Eventually, the Federal Impact Aid Office had to step in and tell the state that that was technically illegal. And if they continued that practice, they would no longer be able to take credit for impact aid. That led to the 1985 impact aid fix, which meant that the state was crediting us at 95% of the impact aid that we were receiving. And then they were also crediting local revenue, which is that 50 cents per every $1,000 of taxable property that was coming in from property taxes. In 1988, the state further amended its formula to stop taking credit for what was known as the Indian set-aside portion of the impact aid funding formula. Now, during this time, public schools were using their property tax value to fund their capital outlay. Their operational funding was coming through the State Equalization Guarantee. For McKinley County, for example, our property value is very small, and the amount of impact aid we were receiving in order to resolve that issue was being taken essentially by the state. So by the time 1998 rolled around, Zuni, Gallup, and the Grant School District got together and actually sued the state because we couldn't actually build schools. We could not maintain our schools. And of course, while education is about many things, having an environment where a student can learn, an adequate building, temperatures that are consistent, the ability to use other educational facilities to enhance education, those are all things that are very important to the educational process. And Zuni, Gallup, and Grants did not have any financial way to raise any money to fix those problems. In 1999, the court actually ruled that New Mexico's funding formula for capital outlay purposes was unconstitutional. And so the state legislature immediately tried to begin kind of resolving that issue by enacting new legislation. And one of the steps that they took was actually reducing the credit from 95% to 75%. They also created what's now currently known as the Public School Capital Outlay Council, which actually generates allocations for capital outlay funding for districts who have the inability to actually bond sufficiently to build a public school. During this time, there was another lawsuit filed. So the first piece was capital outlay. The district judge in that case said, yes, this is unconstitutional. The state, this is going to be a long-term issue. And I'm going to leave the court open, the court judgment open with a special master to monitor and make sure that the state is living up to its promise. So in 2003, there was another lawsuit filed in relation to the way that the state was actually calculating its equalization in order to take credit for funds. That case eventually went to the Supreme Court of the United States, but the only question that was asked, which wasn't, is the funding equal in New Mexico? Are all students being served? Those were not questions that were posed to the court. The only question that was posed is, was the formula that the state was using allowable? And essentially, the court didn't answer that question either. The court said, we don't know. The formula is too complex, and we are not actuaries or accountants, and we don't understand it either. But what we will do, because it appears the federal law is ambiguous, we will rely on a prior court hearing which said, if a statute is ambiguous, then the court will rely on the cognizant oversight agency to determine what the answer is. And in this case, that was the US Department of Education. So the US Department of Education at that time said, yes, New Mexico can use the formula that they're putting forward. And that essentially ended that lawsuit. In 2005, there was one additional change made to the credit that was being taken. The credit had moved from 95 to 75%. And that 20% difference was mandated by the state to be put into capital outlay funds. In 2005, that 20% requirement was removed. I actually spoke with Rick Mieta, who was the House representative at that time who proposed that bill. And he told me that it was pushed from superintendents statewide on flexibility of use of funding that really drove that decision. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of statutes and numbers at you, so I thought I would include a practical example of how this works. So when we look at the credits that are taken, when we get our impact aid, we don't write a check back to the state of New Mexico. What the state does is reduce the amount of state aid that we're going to receive based upon our impact aid. So the state's funding formula is utilized, essentially taking the demographics of all of our students times their various indices, which spits out a total number of units, transferring students into units. That's multiplied by the unit value to get us our program cost. And so that's what you're going to see up here where it says funding program cost. That's the average of the 80th, 120th student count applied through the New Mexico funding formula. And let's say, for example purposes, that that's $85 million. Now, the district gets $25 million in impact aid operational. So the state is going to take credit for $18.7 million of that. And then they also take 75% of property and oil and gas revenues that are collected through tax collections. And so for us, that's about $225,000. Remembering again that the amount of money that's being collected there, which used to almost be $9 for every $1,000 of taxable property, is now only 50 cents per every $1,000 of taxable property. So the amount of money coming in statewide from that credit is really low. It's about $20 million statewide. If you take a quick look at that, GMCS is paying $18.7 million by themselves, when the entire state is contributing about $20 million. And then Forest Reserve, again, it's a federally impacted type situation where land has been taken off the tax rolls due to the designation of federal forest land. And so this is also an annual appropriation where Congress will appropriate funds to districts because those lands have been taken off the tax rolls. These funds are usually not substantial in nature. At most, we may receive $100,000 for the lands that we have removed. And so that's another $75,000. So Gallup will actually receive out of the $85 million that we were told in operational funding we needed in order to operate our school districts, we will receive $65 million. So while that sounds like sufficient funding, supporting a district of our size, including the distance between school sites and the many mitigating factors we have, and the fact that we didn't have funds for capital outlay, so we were having to use our operational funds to maintain buildings and continue capital outlay, really put our district behind. And thinking that this had been going on since essentially 1974 until 2002, you've got decades of decay that happened in our buildings and facilities. And so at this point, our district is $262 million behind in funding capital outlay projects. So what does that look like? What does the credit look like statewide? So when we looked at the total credit that was taken, which was $77.5 million approximately, 22 million of that credit was taken from Gallup-McKinley County Schools, 17 million from Central Consolidated, 5.4 million from Zuni, and only $4 million from Albuquerque Public Schools. Now, you may be saying, wait, it's a 75% credit. How is Albuquerque so far behind these other districts? And the reason behind that was the change in the property tax. So with only 50 cents for every $1,000 coming off of property tax, the amount of money that was coming from non-impact aid districts in the state is hugely smaller than the amount of funding that's coming from impact aid districts. And so the three most heavily impacted impact aid districts, which is Gallup, Central Consolidated, and Zuni, you can see makes up more than 50% of the graph. So New Mexico is very unique. So every state in the union uses a different methodology for funding schools. And that's both on the capital outlay side and the operational side. And as we've kind of discussed, you can see how those lines can kind of be blurred when you don't have enough of either resource, how you may need to pull resources from one of the other areas just to continue an appropriate education. So property taxes essentially, based upon the Big Mac tax cuts that happened from 1981 to 1983, meant that property taxes were no longer the major driver in how operational funds were attained for public schools. These were typically left, these property values were left for capital outlay expenditures and completely at the discretion of the individual districts. And so if you have a district that's very property wealthy, they were able to raise large amounts of funding with very little impact to their tax rates. So for example, I don't know how many of you are property taxpayers in your local county, but our tax rates in McKinley County are one of the highest in the state. As a matter of fact, we are 3 points over the statewide average. So for the debt service that our taxpayers pay, they pay 8.32 mils, which means $8 and approximately 32 cents for every $1,000 of taxable property that they have. The statewide average is about $5. So for the 20% of taxpayers that we have, they're paying more money for less bonding capacity. And a lot of what New Mexico appropriates now for public schools in the operational comes from the general fund. And the general fund is made up of gross receipts tax, selective sales taxes, income tax, both corporate and personal, severance taxes, which largely has to do with oil and gas, interest, rents and royalties, tribal revenue sharing. So those are agreements that we've made with tribal nations, and then miscellaneous receipts and reversions. And so why this is such a big deal is that the lack of diversity in the economy in New Mexico, which you probably hear talked about a lot, means that we fall victim to the ebb and flow of the oil and gas market. Because a good portion of our operational funding for public schools comes from the general fund. And a big portion of what comes out of the general fund are those severance taxes to oil and gas. And so occasionally we have a year in New Mexico, for example, the end of 2016. So in calendar year 2016 in the state of New Mexico, the state actually finished in a deficit, which means we had overspent the amount of money that we had in the bank as a state. The state could not actually issue checks because there was not enough money in the coffers to cover it. What ended up happening was a special session was convened, and they essentially clawed back funds from every entity that they could, including public schools. So for Gallup-McKinley, they took about $2 million from us, which was huge. The district tries to maintain a very conservative stance to ensure that we can weather when downturns in the economy happen. And essentially the state kind of raided all of the schools for their additional savings that they had been holding on to weather the storm. So we, as school districts, try the best that we can with our limited capacity, knowing that we don't have a lot of opportunity to raise additional funds. So we have to be very efficient with the funds that are given to us. We have to make sure that we squeeze every penny out of every dollar that we receive. So one of the things, based upon the lawsuit that was filed and the new funding formula for capital outlay that was put forward, is how are things different statewide? And if you've traveled throughout the state, and I traveled throughout the state, and I did so when my son was in baseball, looking at different facilities throughout the state of New Mexico is you see significant differences between facilities. And the reason behind that is everything that we've been discussing. So a lot of property poor districts can only remodel. They can't afford new school buildings. Their classrooms are much smaller. And of course, when you're talking about social emotional learning and helping the whole child, being able to split into different groups of students and have maybe, you know, independent learners in one area and a group going on in another area, that requires space. And so these smaller classrooms really inhibit the way that we're able to deliver services to our students. We have a lack of special needs spaces for students. We have ancillary providers that provide services wherever they can. And that may be in a cafeteria, it may be in a gym, it may be in a repurposed area of the school. But we don't have specific rooms usually. There's not extra space to provide those services. And especially for, you know, special needs students who may be autistic, that maybe need some tactile reference in order to help them. We don't have the ability to fund that. The state does not see language classrooms and culture classrooms as an adequate type funding project. When you see a school in the state of New Mexico, the state will only participate in one multi-use athletic field. So if you see a school that has more than one athletic field, that school paid for all the fields on their own above and beyond what the state was willing to participate in. And there are many districts that don't need any funding from the state in order to build. Santa Fe Public Schools, for example, they're able to bond and build whatever they like, and they don't have to be within the restrictions of the state. There's lots of value engineering that happens. So some of the schools that we actually were able to build after the Zuni Capital Outlay lawsuit, because we had to live within the restrictions of the state adequacy standards, were really value engineered. So for example, we had schools that were built where classrooms didn't have individual air filtration coming into them. All of the air filtration is in the hallways. So in order to get air into the classroom, you have to leave the classroom door open because it was cheaper to only drop air in those central locations. Well, for anybody who's been around for a little while, that's really dangerous. You cannot just leave doors open in public schools for safety purposes. Not only that, if you have every single classroom with all of their doors open, there's lots of noise that's happening in between those classrooms and lots of distractions. Very low funding for maintenance and upkeep, which means for what we had, we couldn't keep up with it. We couldn't keep the buildings in excellent shape. We really fell behind. When things were broken, it was very hard to replace them, especially high ticket items that cost significant amounts like HVAC and air ventilation systems. And you can't really open a school with only adequacy funding. So for a school district like ours, because of how rural we are and there's a severe lack of infrastructure, one of the things that is considered above adequacy for the state and is not funded is off-site utilities. So if I want running water and electricity and natural gas to flow to a school site, I need to be able to come up with all the money in order to fund those projects, which means if I have to spend money, say $2 or $3 million on off-site utilities, then I'm going to have to cut somewhere in the school site because I'm no longer going to have the money to do our state match to meet that part of the school. So what is the reality? The reality is facilities are vastly different. Indian education is not and has not been fully funded in the state. And what we've really seen as far as Indian education is just ad hoc programs where a little bit of funding is given, maybe $25,000 or $50,000, but no significant resources put there. I will say that that tide is turning. This legislative session, I've been pleasantly surprised to see several bills from different legislators that target this issue because it is very important. It is very important to the community that I serve that we honor the responsibility that we have that was written out in the Indian Education Act. Property tax rates for districts are very different. And because of that, it's hard to attract staff to our district. You're coming to a community that doesn't have as many resources as do other parts of New Mexico. We definitely don't have the urban setting that, say, in Albuquerque, a Santa Fe, a Las Cruces has. And our houses cost more, and you're going to pay higher taxes. So those are hard stories to sell to qualified educators. We've really been forced to use our operational funding for capital and maintenance needs for decades. Our teacherages alone cost $38 million to the district, and we leveraged impact aid funding in order to pay for that. We went to the New Mexico Finance Authority and borrowed money in order to build those units so that we could have places for teachers to stay. Property wealth really gives you more local control. I will tell you, in order for me to build a building with the state, it takes about 5 years. It takes us a good year to just get through the administrative paperwork to even start the process of building a new school. And then after that, it's just more bureaucracy. And also the property wealthy districts, because they're not having that draw on the operational funds to fund capital outlay, are really able to provide higher salaries for staff. And you can always kind of see that when the statewide comparisons of salary scales come out, that realistically, these types of schools that are in those high property value districts are largely able to provide better resources for their staff. The legislative changes, they're in front of the legislature right now. And I did make a minor modification as Senate Bill 41 was modified, is essentially looking at, okay, how is New Mexico funded? How does impact aid play into that funding? What are the current results based upon the funding formula we have with impact aid credits? And what maybe do we need to do legislatively to modify that? So proposed by Representative Lundstrom, House Bill 6 would essentially eliminate the credits. It would return the impact aid funding to the school districts, which is what other property affluent school districts enjoy already, because again, it's replacing property value. Property taxes are not used for the operation of public schools. It would also eliminate the half-mil credit as well as the federal forest reserve credit. We would, as school districts, be required to spend those funds on Indian education, capital outlay, and community schools, which is perfect for our district. That's exactly what we want to spend the funding for. Senate Bill 41, which is Senator Mimi Stewart's bill, is a little bit more complex. It does eliminate the credits, but it requires a change to the capital outlay funding formula state match over a 10-year period. And I'm going to discuss with you in a little bit why that's even more complicated. You'll notice that I have some line items that have been struck. So that was original language that has since been amended out through committee. And essentially, she had tied to that bill that the effective date of the bill is only contingent upon the dismissal of the Zuni capital outlay lawsuit and withdraw of school districts that receive federal impact aid funds from Yazzie Martinez education sufficiency lawsuit, and no earlier than July 1st. So when this bill was originally introduced, she basically wanted us to agree to give up our rights to sue the state for equity and funding for our students. We were very happy to see that portion amended out. Senate Bill 225 also eliminates the credits, and Senate Bill 249 would also eliminate just the impact aid credits and not the half-mil or forest reserve. So the legislature is very aware of this issue at this time and is actively seeking some resolutions for it. One of the issues that we hear is that if the 75% credit is taken out, then the rest of the state will be impacted because that funding will no longer be going into the general fund. And so they will suffer because these funds will not be available. And so they're going to have to cut the unit value. One of the important things to look at is the history of reversions in the state of New Mexico. So one of the things that we had discussed is that there's essentially a formula it turns students into units. The units are multiplied by a unit value. That unit value is decreased by credits. And then there is a state equalization guarantee that has to be sent out by the state. What happens is, based upon appropriation, based upon the number of units, the state sets a unit value. Well, in looking through the Legislative Finance Committee session publications, we noticed that the state was continually, over multiple years, setting the unit value so low that funds designated for education were automatically reverting back to the general fund of the state. So this, for example, was obtained through a IPRA, and I requested the calculations for the 1920 unit value. And no scenario that's provided here would actually distribute the full appropriation of funds that were given by the legislature. So even though there were 3 different scenarios proposed, not a single one of those scenarios would actually distribute all of the money that the legislature had appropriated. And so that's what this kind of demonstrates. So looking at the public school support, the legislature actually appropriated about $3.1 billion. And now there's some variances down here based upon credits that are estimated. But there is no circumstance here that shows that if that credit was taken away, so in the very last column on the right hand of your screen, this would be what it would look like for FY20 if there were no impact aid credits taken. Even if there were no impact aid credits taken, there would still be $72 million that would revert to the general fund. Now, the state didn't choose to make any changes to the 1920 funding formula, so credits were still taken. And so the actual amount that reverted was closer to the blue section of about $182 million. And that's because large portions of what was actually allocated for the K-5 Plus program, an extended school year program, those programs which were supposed to help students who are at risk and who have exceptional needs to move up more quickly in their educational services, were reverted to a large extent. And so now the state has about $186 million in a reversion fund for all of these funds that were appropriated but never actually made it to the school districts. And so this is one of the things, especially in school finance, that's hard for people to understand, is that people say, but the legislature gave you all this more money. And that's true. The legislature did appropriate the money, but the money never actually made it to the district or the charter school. So talking about litigation and administrative changes, I have been part of advocacy for many years, and that's active advocacy, including participation in litigation, preparing briefs for litigation, testifying, providing affidavits, as well as going through administrative processes to try to stop what's happening. So the consolidated Yazzie-Martinez case essentially found these findings. Our district is a participant. The Yazzie that is cited in this case is actually a student from our district. And we were able to actually prove that the state has failed to comply with state and federal laws in the education of Native American students, our English language learner students. They were not funding or supporting the Indian Education Act, Bilingual Multicultural Indian Education Act, the Hispanic Education Act, and it's really resulted in an inadequate education system for New Mexico students. There's violation of the state constitution. That's one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, where we talked about a uniform and sufficient system of education for all students. The court essentially found that the state statement that there was a lack of funds was not an excuse for denying an education. And that's some of the information that we've been able to use to combat that theory, is those reversion funds, where the state says there's just no more money that we can give you to help mitigate these issues, when in reality, for years, they have been underfunding the funding that actually made it to the districts and sending money back into the general fund. And then the last thing was that PED has failed to meet its oversight functions. And we're starting to see that a little bit more as legislators actually put specific words in what the state needs to do in order to monitor how funds are being utilized and ensuring that programs that are funded are actually improving outcomes for our students. The Zuni Capital Outlay lawsuit, that was the one that we talked about that was filed in 1999. And essentially, we claimed, so McKinley County, Grants, and Zuni, that although there was a sort of equalized system for operational, the lack of any system for capital had really created in total a disequalized system. The state found in our favor through the courts and essentially appointed a special master to oversee those changes. Unfortunately, between 1998 and 2015, the special master that was over that case had passed away, and no one had asked for a new special master to be appointed. So Gallup-McKinley and TAXABLE and Zuni Public Schools requested that a new special master be appointed. And we essentially went back into trial and litigation on that. On December 29th of 2020, in local district court here in Gallup, the judge found again the state is still not funding public schools adequately for capital outlay, and again found that the state's capital outlay system is unconstitutional. In addition to that, Zuni Public Schools, Central Consolidated, and Gallup have looked at the disparity challenge that's required to take credit for impact aid funding. And so every state is different in the way that they fund public schools, but in order to take credit, a state has to send to the federal government, specifically the US Department of Education Impact Aid Office, a calculation of how it equalizes expenditures among school districts. And so what the state had been submitting was just data from the State Equalization Guarantee. Well, federal law doesn't say the state gets to designate which pot of money it reports. Federal law actually states any funding provided by the state that is not required to be repaid. And so when we looked at that, we really saw all of these other funding sources that had been given for education that were never reported to the federal government. And so we actually redid that calculation and submitted it. And the state for the fiscal year of 2020 was found to be disequalized and unable to take credit. The state has challenged that and subsequently kind of pulled back on that challenge. And so recently, an administrative law judge has told the state that they need to repay the dollars they credited from us. For our school district, for one school year alone, it's approximately $24 million. I included several resources on here. So a lot of what I've talked about is actually included within these various resources. And I'm going to open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer that. And I can definitely provide my email. If anyone has any specific questions, wants documentation, wants other presentations, I'm always happy to talk about this. Because the reality is, the students in McKinley County, the students in Zuni Public Schools, the students in Central Consolidated, the students in Grants have not been getting their fair shake. And so it is incumbent upon us as administrators to do everything that we can to ensure that the students we serve get the resources they need so that they can become successful members of our society.
Thank you so much, Jvanna, for explaining things I certainly didn't understand. I have a much clearer understanding. If anyone has questions, you can just unmute yourself and jump right in if you have specific questions for Jvanna.
Now, I do understand this is a hugely complex subject. It's been going on for decades. There's a multitude of issues concerning it. And so, you know, I give numerous different presentations to people, and it's almost overwhelming the amount of, I would say, how long this has actually been able to go on, right, and the deficiencies that exist because of it. It's really just it's unimaginable that this has been allowed to continue. I'm always happy to talk to any communities, any tribal leaders, anyone who wants to learn more about what's happening, simply because I think that it is so prohibitive because it's complex. Many people say that that's just way too much statutes and data and numbers, and they get a little bit intimidated. But we have to remember that our leaders are here to support and serve us. And so they have to figure out a way to work with us to make it so that we really do have a uniform and sufficient system.
It's a question and more so a comment. I am the tribal liaison. I work with Jemez Valley Public Schools, and I really do appreciate Ms. Hanks for you coming out and providing this presentation. I know Jemez Valley Public Schools with our former superintendent, Dr. Pasal. I think if I recall correctly, we met with you guys at the legislature at the state capitol when the first round of this was going on to try and change things. So I really do appreciate the different school districts taking on and putting forth a lawsuit. Right now, as a tribal liaison, and especially being from a small school district where a lot of our students reside on tribal lands. And so having full funding through impact aid could do, if we're able to get the full amount, they could do so much for our school district. I think right now, one area is, yes, we don't want to spend too much money. I should say that the majority of our funds tend to go towards staff. And without the staff, we don't have the school. But even though that's the case, we still do have limited amount of staff. So we have staff that are wearing multiple hats and are getting cross-trained and trying to serve to ensure that we're all there to be able to meet all the needs of our students. But I think if we were able to get the full amount that is designated for us, this would definitely allow us to hire staff so that we can continue to focus on each of us, mainly what our purpose is within our school districts. And I think that's the other piece too, is that knowing that it's very hard for us to find funding to hold positions to do the different types of programming that we would love to do and do a successful job at it. I just think that there's so much that would happen for our school districts if we were able to get 100% of our impact aid funds. So in that sense, I really do appreciate you taking the opportunity to educate, even though I've been in many presentations, again, like just mentioned by the previous lady who spoke, there's so much information and I learn something and retain something every single time. So I think that you reaching out and being able not only to provide this to tribal leadership to understand the process that we go through, but I think it's also important for families of non-native students to understand where some of the funding comes from for the school districts, and knowing too that if I understood correctly, again, the funds that come in from impact aid aren't tied just to those native students that help bring in the funds. It's for the entire school district. And so understanding that this is important. It's important for everyone to get behind to advocate for us to receive all funding because all students benefit. So thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, you know, I appreciate hearing from different people, having questions asked to me. I learn stuff all the time too. And I will tell you that I already have a more than full-time job at the school district I work at. So this is a lot of nights, a lot of weekends, a lot of data research, but I won't stop. I will not stop until there's a resolution. And I've been at it almost 5 years solid now. And so there has to be a resolution at some point because people just can't stand back anymore and say this is okay.
Yeah, this is Lloyd. Thank you. I think this was like Dr. Flowerday mentioned, this is new for me too, and it's really good to kind of get an idea exactly how this is calculated. And the one striking thing was that you mentioned was that the funding formula has been amended 50 times. And it seems like it's getting worse. And there's no resolution. And it sounds like it's mostly about politics now. and about who gets what and who wants to protect what they've gotten in the past. So what are your thoughts, just sort of your perspective on some of these legislative bills that are in the session now? What are the chances of them succeeding in changing some of the way that impact aid is determined in the state?
Good question.
Sure. So we're very hopeful, actually, and it's been a lot of the education that's actually happened. It's great that you mentioned that. So what we heard, especially when we testified in committees, was that we don't want winners or losers. And what was hard for us to swallow is that we've been the loser for almost 50 years. So you're okay with us staying the loser as long as it doesn't impact you. But the reality is that that's not where we are as a state. Our state has put out within its constitution, its ideology, uniform and sufficient. That is the ideology of the state. And so really, it's been a lot of education. When we were actually able to appear in person, we spent weeks just testifying in front of committees, meeting individually with legislators, handing out things. Several legislators told us, just sue us. I'm not gonna vote for anything related to impact aid. If you want to make a difference, sue us. So we did. I mean, I don't want to go that way. I don't want to force litigation to drive legislation, because that's not the best way for good legislation to pass. But when you leave yourself in such a small corner and they're basically saying, we're not going to help you, you have to do something. And so what's actually happened is fostering those relationships. We actually have some very significant legislators that are behind us now. I know even the Speaker of the House last year sponsored a bill for impact aid and is again sponsoring one this year with Representative Lundstrom. So we're just really hoping that there's some sort of resolution to this, but we're not gonna back down, and we're gonna use every avenue we can to fix the problem, such as the challenge at the federal level to the disparity data being submitted by the state. And that did require us to learn that whole entire federal statute, attempt to get statewide data, redo all of the data statewide, which we had to do through IPRAs because none of that data is readily available. But it's what we have to do. This is where we are in order to try to fix this problem. And so it's not about taking away from anybody else. And what was a difficult pill for us to swallow was people saying, rising tides lift all boats. Well, that's not true when your boat is so far behind. The reality is you can't leave a school district or a school without resources for 50 years and catch up within 1 year. That's just not reality. And so I think after a lot of education, we've changed some minds. Are there people who still actively are against this? Yes. Will they spread misinformation like, if we give this back to you, we'll have to take money from the other school districts and all these kids will suffer? Well, the reality is there's tons of reversions. You're not giving out all the money that you have right now. So that's not true, obviously. And so it's combating all of those misconceptions time after time. And really, I'm very lucky that I have a school district that is behind what I'm doing. And I've got other people, Martin Romine down in Zuni. I've got Central Consolidated Schools, even though they just lost their finance person. But it's really been a team effort for all of us to come together. And it's so important that the communities we serve talk to legislators too, because it can't just be us telling them. It's got to be the communities too telling them this has to change.
Hi there. I don't have a question, more so a comment. I'm on the Equity Council at my elementary school located here in Espanola, New Mexico. And I reached out to the Institute for American Indian Education organization. So this is kind of like so new to me. But we, on our Equity Council, we're getting a lot of parents that are asking for us to respond to, Native American education issues. So I think this is a good place for me and my school to start. And I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm grateful for the research that you guys are doing and the work that you have already put into all of this. And if I could just continue coming to these brown bag meetings, that would just be so helpful for me.
Sure.
So.
And you know, my email is in there. You guys are more than welcome to email me any questions that you have. I kind of pride myself in being, I go through my email every day and answer my email every day. It's one of my things, because I know communication is so essential, and we've all become so dependent on electronic communication that, you know, getting that rapid response is so important. But we need everybody, even people who are just walking in the door that say, I want to help. There's a way for you to help.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and I thank you all, and you know, together in the struggle. Together in the struggle. Thank you.